ozone layer was da 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 da. I begin to change my relationship. It stops being an it, which has no meaning or significance to it. And we can apply that to anything, almost anything. And I want to explore that I, it, I, thou bit. And coming into it in a little moment, and what's the thing that's going on in the relationship that might specifically affect our health. And there is growing body of evidence of 3 particular fields I want to draw on. Are you with me so far? Let me give you a couple of examples. Just little anecdotes really to inform the discussion. Was a few years back, one of my clients in spiritual direction was dying. A lovely man who was privileged to be alongside him for 3 years after a diagnosis of colon cancer. And I'm not quite sure how he turned up. Well, we know how he may well have turned up there, but the reasons why we thought he turned up were not the reasons why he was really there. He was in a distressed state because of his diagnosis, and he'd been told he'd only got about 3 or 4 months to live, and was very, very angry. And he came along and sat in the sanctuary where we have our little meetings, and sat there, arms folded, and said, "I'm not sure why I'm here. I don't believe in God, and this is a complete waste of time, but my wife said I had to come, because she said she can't stand living with me at the moment. And if you mention God once, I'm out." Right? So he then spent about an hour and a half telling me about the God he didn't believe in, while I listened. And so began our journey together as he explored what was really going on with him beneath the anger, which was, I'm frightened. Why is this happening to me? If there is a God, why am I being punished like this? So on and so on and so forth. You see all that pattern there. So commonly arises when we hit the kind of work we do at Sacred Space. A lot of people come because they've hit a crisis point, which we would see as a wake-up call. And the crisis point is something like, I've been told I'm dying, or my partner's left me, or my child is sick, or I'm losing my job, or I'm facing prison. All those kind of persons I've sat with in the past few weeks. And at some level they're looking for, at a simple level, can we please solve this problem so I can feel better? But what people are looking for is something that lies beneath it, which is why is this going on? How am I going to end up with this? Why do I feel all this pain? Where is this fear? How do I deal with it? So it's a common feature that a crisis can lurch people into exploring the deeper questions of their meaning and purpose in life. Some people don't need a crisis to do that. And also, if you look at some recent research, which I'll put the names up in a bit, but Les Lancaster's recent work has impressed me, that he's showing up in his work, along with his colleague and several others, that one of the ways that we approach a crisis, the healthy outcome, is when we can find in it that which has led us to transform, which shifts us from being a victim, I've got cancer, why is God punish me kind of thing, to what is there in this cancer, all this suffering, all this facing prison, or divorce, or death, what is there in it that helps me to see myself and the world anew, and it's transformation that occurs. Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, if you're really looking, be prepared to get disturbed. And when you get disturbed, you will be turned around, metanoia. And when you are turned around, then you will discover the kingdom of heaven. So that notion that what Lancaster and others were finding was that the people who seem to pass through these life crises most healthily is that they move out from being a victim of the crisis to seeing something in it that helps them to transform the way they are in the world. And I've lost count of the numbers of times I've sat with people who have said something like, and I'm paraphrasing, I wouldn't say it out there, Stephen, beyond these 4 walls, but I'm almost glad I had cancer. I'm not angry anymore at the fact that I was abused as a child. I'm almost glad it happened, because if not that, then this. And what they've done is they've gone into that dark pit of their suffering, whatever its form, and they've found a diamond there that shines. They've found the grace in the suffering, which can be... Now, I'm not suggesting for any moment, okay, everybody, let's bring on the suffering and we'll all get in like this. It doesn't work like that, or that we necessarily invite it up. Although there is an argument in the Jungian sense that in the unconscious way, we actually do invite suffering in order to change, which is kind of a scary thought. But I'm mindful of Sid, this person I was telling you about, as he went through his suffering and was close to death to the point where he could no longer come and see me and I had to go and see him. And they'd moved his bed into the conservatory so he could see the bird table. And we were both keen bird watchers. And part of our regular fortnightly discourse was, I've seen this, no you haven't, I've seen this, and I've seen more of these. We get into Twitch competitiveness of who's seen the most interesting bird or whatever that week. And we got to a silly stage where we were quite convinced that golden eagles, flocks of them were flying through Penrith in Cumberland, which was And he rode up. Sid, one morning I arrived and he was sobbing. And it was a different kind of sobbing that I'd been used to in him, in that he was... There were tears of joy. And I sat with him for a while. His wife left us in the room. I said, okay, what's going on this morning? Shall we have a quiet moment? And this was 3 years down the line. After many discourses, many times I taught him to meditate, how to simply hold anxiety, all the usual stuff. And he said, I don't want you to say anything. And I just want you to listen to the story. And he'd been sitting watching the bird tail at the garden, and the cat had crept up, grabbed a chaffinch, and was at the bottom of the table with it, and had proceeded to chew on it, and then ran away with it. All the other birds scattered, and then the birds started coming back. And he said, years ago, I'd have chased the cat away and tried to rescue the bird. And he said, just looking at it, he said, I just looked at it all, and I knew it was all good. And for him, that was his God moment. And we didn't, you know, for some people the word God is not relevant, and whatever you think God isn't anyway. But for him, that was the moment when he got it. And that was his breakthrough point, when he was able authentically, in the remaining 6 weeks, to do things that he'd never done before, which included healing his relationship with his son, whom he'd never told him that he loved him, and he did, and then finally told him, and shifting relationship, and he died peacefully. He died peacefully. And what he'd done was used his suffering, just hold it in that moment, and got away from, in that moment, that somehow suffering is pointless, and it is somehow part of the great cycle of birth and death, and it's okay. There's something about the essence of life beneath what I'm seeing of a cat killing a bird, that somehow that is absolutely a perfect moment. And we went on to discuss how he said he felt he was, he used the word, I feel like I'm witnessing everything. Look at that word, I'm watching everything. And then we moved, well, of course the question then is not what are you watching, is who is doing the watching? That's the great spiritual question. People often, because of the work I do, say, you know, well, do you think God exists? And I say no, because, you know, existence is not a quality. God is beyond existence. Existence is in God. I don't want to get into theological stuff. But the more important question I come back is to say, that's not the real question. The real question is, who is asking that question? Who is it that's asking that question? And with my colleagues and others around about, in particular the Northwest area, we've been working with NHS trusts in training staff in compassion. Training for compassion. But the bosses like those words, so we use them and it gets us in there. And one of the questions that we take the participants through, and it startles them, is they're given an exercise in saying, who am I? Who am I? And of course, the immediate response is, well, it's obvious I'm a wife, I'm a nurse, I'm a doctor, I'm a mother. And as they're invited through various processes to explore more deeply, who am I? they enter the abyss, which is really scary. Because if you begin to peel back, well, if I'm not a wife, a mother, a sister, a daughter, a nurse, if those are all personalities, roles I inhabit, what's left? And as they pass through that, through their definitions of self, what we notice is they move through the shadow into the light of saying, well, if I'm not definable, if I simply am, if I am, without requiring a definition, that sets me free. And often you can tie that into the Moses story when he goes up the mountain and says to God, I'm losing the Israelites here, they're having a wild time and I can't control them, they want to go back to Egypt. You've got to give me something, they've got a nice golden calf. You've got to give me something that I can take down and you've got to tell me who you are. And of course, God's reply is, here, I am that I am the one who is. And so, and then we move on into the Jesus story about his I am words, the I amness. And the point I'm making there is that part of the shift of the relationship is with myself, of who I think I am, which may not be who I really am. And when I begin to touch who I really am, my own I amness, that's what sets me free. Maybe that's the truth that sets us free. A few years back I was given one of my several cancer diagnoses, and I was in the Newcastle, not the RVI, the Freeman Hospital. And I've got a marvellous team around me, they're great, they're technically brilliant, they're absolutely super. And after the tests had come through, one of my therapists took me on one side and said, well, Stephen, now that you're a cancer patient, there's some things we need to talk about. And my immediate response was, no, I'm not. Don't give me another bloody title. I've spent 30 years acquiring them and losing one. Don't give me another one. I am not a cancer patient. I am experiencing having cancer. My body has cancer, but I don't. And I saw my therapist mentally reach for a writing pad, refer to psychotherapist in Durham. And over the years, we've had very interesting conversations about, oh, I think I see what you mean now, Stephen. That quality of the I amness, the relationship with our essential self. Another point, going on from Sid's questioning of self and all it is and his acceptance of it, was of a young woman, a middle-aged woman. When I first encountered her, I was asked to help her because she had been walking through Carlisle and had seen the man who abused her when she was a child. She was 45 years old by this stage, and she'd seen him and followed him. The man was in his early 80s by this stage, and waited till he got home and went and banged on the door and said, it's you. She was stricken with it. She was so terrified, she was brave. The terror gave her the courage, and she knocked on this man. Yeah, this is no secret, this is always in the local papers and everything. And then began a protracted, and the man admitted it on the doorstep, and then she went to the police, and so the story unfolded. And she then spent a year as there were inquiries, police, trial, and so on and so forth. And she was sent to me to help her out with the stress of all of this, to be a listening ear to her. And at one point, I never used the word at all, but she decided what I was thinking at one point and said, I know you were going to say to me, you're going to tell me that if I'm going to get through this, I've got to forgive him. Now I know the truth is, forgiveness is the thing that actually ultimately sets you free. If we look at the studies on forgiveness, you're far likely to be healthier after trauma than if you've not been able to forgive. Plenty of studies to support that. So Janet then went through this process, and we'd made arrangements when the trial was coming to a conclusion that I would be available afternoon, she'd come out and be with me and debrief, download, screen, rant, whatever she needed to do. And as I opened the door, she arrived that afternoon after the court case had been finished. She was shiny, that's all I can say, she was shiny. I knew something's happened. And we came and sat down and we talked about it, and there were lots of tears and lots of words. But she said, I don't know I don't understand how it happened, but I feel so free. And she related the story that the judge was about to pronounce sentence on the man, and he was stood there, and he invited her as the victim to say, is there anything you want to say before I pass sentence? This is your opportunity. And she found herself standing there, looking at this elderly man, and turning to the judge and saying, I will plead for leniency. He's no hold over me anymore. He's an old man. And she used, I plead for leniency. Those were her words. That's forgiveness. Something had shifted in her where she realised that unless she'd let him go, he still had a hold over her. And there was that very powerful letting go in a public place, in a court. And so there was something there where she shifted her relationship to him. When we explored this later, he stopped being the abuser, the dirty old man, the nasty man, the thing, the it. She saw through the course of the court case an old, broken man, a soul like her, lost and wounded, and that invoked in her pity and through that compassion. She was able to have compassion for it. And when you think that leap from being an abused child to being a compassionate adult, look at that journey. But she made that shift from I it to I thou, and it helped her to change her life. She was absolutely married again, so on and so forth, and was very happy as a result of that. But the last point I would want to make about relationship is a personal story. When I was training at the Interfaith Seminary, we were doing Buddhism. We had a module on Buddhism, we had a module on this and a module on that. And we had Buddhism followed by Christianity. Now, at that time my house was full of Buddhist iconography. I'd hung out at Samye Ling, I'd been to many meetings with the Dalai Lama and sort of found him enchanting and learned a lot from him and so forth. And this was something I was touching on earlier with Chris, but what I realised is I was sat there in the forest in Germany, I had a week's retreat before returning to the seminary, and during that retreat I thought, I'll be quiet, I can write my assignment on Buddhism. And I knew Buddhism, read the books, I knew the Eightfold Path and Fourfold this and the da-da-da. And it hit me like a bolt of lightning in the forest as I sat there. I don't believe this stuff. I don't believe it. And then following that was something that I was saying to Chris earlier, I've experienced with many people coming in retreat, is saying, I used to be Christian, but now I'm a Buddhist. And what I found, or something else, come to that, but most often they're saying, I'm a Buddhist. And what you realise is, no, the person isn't a Buddhist. They've not gone to Buddhism. They've run away from something else which they perceived as wounded them. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, whatever it might be. They've run away to that, and somehow Buddhism's given them a soft landing. I don't quite, for various reasons, but it's... So they're not really following Buddhism, they're running away from something else which they perceived as wounded them. And so I sat there in the forest thinking, I don't believe this stuff. But there must be something wrong with me because I can't quite get it. And I couldn't write the assignment. My Buddhist books were stacked there and I had to put them all away. And I was thinking, what's going wrong here? And I came back and spoke to the Buddhist teacher when we were in the seminar. And he said, what's your report, Stephen? He said, well, I have real trouble with this. And straight away, he said, well, what's your problem? And that raises my hackles because the assumption is I had the problem. So my ego was in full flight with him at that point. And I said, what I'm doing is I feel like I've gone all this way with this Buddhist stuff. And I feel like somebody's given me a really brilliant book, a novel, and taken away the last page. That there was something missing for me and I couldn't get what it was. And then I said, and I'm beginning to wonder, is it God? These were in my fairly atheistic days. And straight away I said, well, that's just conceptualizing. God is just a concept. And I thought, no, that's not right. What is it you're becoming attached to? And I said, no, it's not that my problem with the Buddhist teaching is the cause of suffering is attachment. And then it hit me, this is just my personal story, I'm not challenging necessarily Buddhist theology, I probably am. But it suddenly dawned on me, maybe the source of suffering is not attachment to things or to persons, but detachment from my source. And once I got that, and I've encountered this in so many people, that what sets them free is not the struggle, the real tough struggle to get free of attachment, but an equally tough, arguably tougher, to see what is your primary source from which you have become detached. What is this thing? We use the expression at Sacred Space called coming home. Whatever that home is for you, but a recognition of the something other, the something deeper, which is the very ground of your being. Soul, essence, your divine nature, whatever it might be. So, am I being clear, Chris?
Yeah.
Yes.
Others may have questions.
Please, I'm not being clear, please interrupt. So there is something there, some quality in that deep inner relationship. And if I'm going to give you some of the research, that when we connect with that, when we feel, and connection is an important word which underpins the very notion of relationship, may transform the way we are in the world, transform the way we behave. Now I'm going to be with PowerPoint now. Now, if I go back to some of those reasons why people believe or long for something other, you can. I remember a meeting with the Dalai Lama in Manchester donkeys years ago. The first was a big thing as opposed to a small audience in the Free Trade Hall. That dates it because I think that's a hotel now. And yes, Free Trade Hall. And the place was packed. And somebody asked him a very long-winded question that was about their marriage. And they were having real problems. And what was his advice? And I absolutely loved this man when he said, well, don't ask me, get a marriage guidance counsellor. And I love that humility that, just because I'm a spiritual person, I don't have all the answers. And then he went on to say, quite bluntly actually, I don't know why you Christians are here. I don't know why you're here. Why are you looking at Buddhism when everything you need is in your own tradition, right under your own nose? And that really startled people, because I think they expected him to say, well, the Buddhist way is the only way, or follow me, but he didn't. He was actually batting it back to people, which I think probably refers to that bit I was touching on earlier, that maybe people are not necessarily going towards a faith, they may be running away from something. And the real work is understanding what is the woundedness that created that running away. What is the woundedness that projected me into escaping something, be it Christianity or Judaism or whatever. So, going back into what this thing is, when the Dalai Lama says, well, what is Christianity all about? What's the difference between that and Buddhism? If we look at this something other, there's been 7 or 8 classic explanations as to why human beings either long for or seek or say they experience to something other. Feuerbach in his essay, we just need God as a comforter. We have to believe there's something other there that will look after us. Marx talked about, we need that to keep us all drugged so we don't have to face reality. What was it T.S. Eliot said? Mankind cannot bear very much reality. I think it's wrong, actually. I think when you get into the real reality, you can't get enough. Absolutely, you can't get enough. Give me more, please. But I speak as someone who's mystically inclined and therefore could spend his life sitting in Durham Cathedral, never moving, just tripping out with the spirits. There's the classic stuff of Freud. We're projecting onto God some figure, the need for a father who will look after us and take care of us. I've lost count of the number of people I've worked with in spiritual direction whose blockage to the beloved, the absolute God, lies in their early father experiences. And to give you a simple example, there was a young man, a northeasterner, sat there cross-legged on the floor, again with a bit of, like this. I said, well, tell me what you think God's like. oh, God is this thing who's up there, and he has a beard, and he'll only speak to you in English. And if you step out of line, you're punished, you get hit, you're made to suffer, and you're told you'll go to hell and all this kind of stuff. So I sat with this, and you can see what's coming now. So we sat with it, this is one of the beauties of modern spiritual direction. We have psychology to draw on. It's a wonderful gift, wonderful gift. And so I said, John, and eventually I said, tell me a bit about your dad. Father was a Methodist minister, hellfire minister. Used to beat me up if I got out of order. Always told me that I was going to hell if I misbehaved. And I thought, wow, well there's, you see the classic pattern of how we project onto God the ultimate authority figure, arguably. Those early experiences of authority figures. And we just carry it on, and it stops us, blocks us our connection. When John, through various contemplative, prayerful, meditative, visualization practices, journaling, everything, when he got, that's not what God is, that set him free. He realised God was not this thing with a beard in the clouds, ready to punish him if he got his act wrong. There's Sartre, the existentialist, about that we simply see this other thing because, how can I express it in Sartre's terms? It's not so much that we want there to be a God, but we want to be God. There has to be something other that we can become in order to have control in the world, power, make sense of life. Hamer's early stuff, fascinating stuff in genetics, found that something like 70% of persons who are spiritually inclined, go to church, believe in God, carry a particular gene, VMA2, VMAT2. And funnily enough, when you think about it, his figure, 70-75% of people believe in God, probably fits with the number of people in this country. If you said to them, do you believe there's something other than God? It's about 75-80% of the population. So it's entirely genetically driven. Newberg and others were suggesting that we're wired for it. There is something in the human psyche that creates neural patterns that gives us a leaning towards the falling into something other, the longing for that comfort. The argument using neo-Darwinism is that somewhere long ago, when human beings were coming into human from ape-like consciousness, we had to face the bitterness and suffering and struggle of the world. But those who fell into mystical states or whatever, believed there was some afterlife or something like that, were able to cope with the depression of being alive, were more likely to survive, and passed on to their children their capacity in their neural networks to adjust to life suffering. And then I've summarised those classic stuff of my own heroine from years back when I started nursing was Florence Nightingale, who you may or may not know was a profoundly mystical person. Barbie Dossie's book, Florence Nightingale, Mystic Healer, she felt she was called to develop nursing by God, and she regales these stories of falling into mystical states and feeling God telling her what she had to do to go to the Crimea, to establish nursing and so forth. But many of the studies, if you look at it, those many reports of those experiences have suggested the person is either epileptic, or they're having a flush of endorphins, or they're on drugs, or something like that. So we have a tremendous capacity to reduce the search for something other to material causes. That lovely quote from James Jones, who was a professor in religious studies and philosophy at New York University, I think. That lovely quote. For the last 200 years, Western culture has been an experiment. I love that. Western culture has been an experiment for 200 years to test the hypothesis that human beings can be totally fulfilled in an atmosphere of secular rationalism, technological efficiency, and material abundance alone. Evidence for the falsity of the claim that we can live without meaning daily pours into psychotherapists' offices. We see the anomie and emptiness symptomatic of the ethos with its disconnection from anything smacking of value, purpose, or the experience of the sacred. And I noticed that even when working with groups of people, like this, working in the healthcare system particularly, and drawing on spiritual contemplative practices to inform the process in the group work, meditation, reflection, and so forth. That one thing that's the language of inner meaning has almost been sterilized of the divine. That so many people know, if I say to you, for example, the story of Job is a great, great story to understand about the nature of deep listening and healing relationships. You know, when Job goes through all that stuff and people come along and say, it'll be all right, Job, or it'll be okay, this, don't worry, because God loves you, or you're a religious man. Job's comforters, which is just what doctors and nurses and those we fall into. Don't worry, it'll be all right, love. You know, we'll make it better for you. And at the end, you can almost hear Job when he turned, I can't remember the exact quote, but Job turns to them and says, listen to what I am saying to you. That is all the comfort I ask of you. Now that's a perfect, beautiful paradigm for nurses, doctor, which is actually, you don't have to fix, listen. Listen to the story. Fixing has a role, but don't, you get that picture? But if you raise the story of Job, or Jesus, or anything like that, or Moses, the one I've just told you, nobody knows about it. It's gone. And words like sacred, prayer, contemplation, communion, they don't mean anything to huge numbers of people now. Probably if I'm working, say, with a group of 30, 40 people, there may be one or two words who would even have some persons who would understand the notion of sacred. Who, if you mention God, have got anything other than a picture of this big old guy who sets one people after another to start wars. That's where most people start and finish. And also I've noticed a contamination effect in the relationship towards faith and towards the divine of an ISIS effect. Terrible shame that they've taken the acronym ISIS, because the ISIS, of course, in Egyptian mythology is anything but the force that they represent. But how now, it doesn't matter what religious tradition you belong, look what religion does, and therefore whatever ISIS is doing applies to Christianity, to Buddhism, and it becomes transferable to all different faiths are now being tarred with the same brush. But Jones is saying that actually there's much more to it. The fact that we've tried to live in material sufficiency, and this is an old quote from a woman who tremendously, a Greek nun, Vasiliki Lanara, and she was, when I read her book, it blew my socks off in 1981. Until then, I was fully into that materialist paradigm. It was the year of Thatcher. If it wasn't Armani, I wouldn't wear it. If it wasn't Porsche, I wouldn't drive it. And I was on this power trip and advising ministers and speaking. I don't know. But it was Lanara, I read this, and she was the first person I read in the healthcare field in 1981 as a nun who was drawing on Christianity, Greek mythology, and nursing and healthcare to make. She drew these strands together, and it's one of those times when you read someone's book and you think, wow, phew. And totally, I began to think about nursing, my part in healthcare, myself completely differently. Then in recent years we've had huge numbers of allegations about the Staffordshire report, mid-staffs recently, all pointing out that actually something's going wrong in healthcare. And if you look at those reports, when patients say that they've encountered doctors who are not caring, and I've met lots of those doctors and nurses down the years, I've been involved in inquiries myself, they don't care. Something has gone on in them that they've had to defend against the anxiety of caring, so they shut off, they disconnect, and patients become it. The appendicectomy in bed 4 is shouting for a drink again, instead of a person. And it's a way of defending against the anxiety of workload pressures, or feeling I can't cope because the person may ask me something, and I've done it myself, countless times. You know, a patient might have said to me in my youth, you know, I'm a dying nurse, and I would say something, oh, don't worry about that, I'll give you a bed bath now. Or I'll make some tea. You know, rattle a trolley, create a distraction. All because I didn't know. Or I would come out with platitudes. And all which had nothing to do with the patient, and I wasn't an uncaring nurse, I just didn't know how to handle it. You know, when the 33rd patient that day asks you for a bedpan and somebody then says to you, you know, I'm worried I'm dying, or I feel sick, or I'm in pain, why is this happening to me? And you don't know how to answer it. Then your recourse is to defences, which is either disconnect and appear to be uncaring. So the question then arises, can we reawaken in people who've disconnected? Look at that word I'm using. That heart-centred self. And the practices we've been using on the programme seem to be working. And fascinating work that Healis, I came across his work at Lancaster, to Healis and Woodhead. They took the whole of Kendal and looked at the religious and spiritual, and saw this pattern emerging of people peeling themselves away from the congregational religions and the great burgeoning growth of seeking spiritual, but they were still what Jones was doing, they were looking for the sacred, but they felt they couldn't find it within the straitjacket, the iron cage as he called it, of the established religions. So they were peeling off into that, and that was taking people like nurses, doctors and others into studying complementary therapies, anything to do with healing, but moving away from the established structure. And one of the fascinating book, I would forget about the other thing of this stuff, Upholster and Roberts ought to be required reasoning for everybody studying the connection between spirituality and well-being. They're from the Tavistock Institute, psychotherapists, I think, by background. Their book, The Unconscious at Work, showed how, for example, healthcare staff, in order to cope with the pain and the suffering, that they don't know how to engage with it, they engage in chronic niceness. And we wander around as nurses, wherever so good, wherever so kind. And I was involved in an inquiry in a hospice where ultimately 14 people were sacked, 30 odd others left. This is a hospice with a small team of staff. And I was asked to co-chair the inquiry, and as we inquired more and more and more, then we found the unthinkable. I've used that word, unthinkable. People said, it's unthinkable that doctors or nurses or therapists would do that. Unthinkable that at Christmas, in a hospice, with somebody, a dead body behind the screens, that the ward sister is welcoming everybody to the drinks trolley in the ward area, and people having glasses of sherry and wine with a body behind the screen. It's unthinkable on night shift when I turned up to find the staff having sent out for a curry and having a picnic party with a curry on the floor, sitting around on the floor or on chairs, and there's a patient dying in a bed in the same room. It's unthinkable that a nurse would swear at a patient who is dying because she's made a mess of the bed. It's unthinkable that a doctor would walk out of a room saying, there's nothing I can do for you, you're just attention seeking, when a patient is lying there. I could go on and on. It scared me spitless, that inquiry. But those were not bad people. You can either say you're an it, you're a bad person, you're a thing, off you go, well thank you. And the trustees decided to do that with a lot of people. With good reason, because they were just not that kind of people to be around the sick and the dying. Or what the heck goes on in people who literally must have turned up in an environment for caring and then have switched off. They do the opposite. What has broken their hearts? Are you still with me so far? Finished. So that notion of what I discerned in those inquiries, there was something missing. There was that dimension there that one of the things that drives people to become uncaring is the feeling, I'm on my own here. I have no resource to draw but myself. And that gets worse if I feel the organisation doesn't support me or the team doesn't support me. That sense of being on my own. And anyone who's been on their own, been in that pit of fear, when you've been frightened because you're dying, or you've been left behind, or you're really sick and in great pain, or you're under the influence of drugs, or you have that dark night of the soul and you realise there's nothing, that, people will tell you, you feel small, it's dark, it's cold, and the only thing you can do is defend by keeping the stuff away. I'm always touched by Macquarie's simple definition of spirituality as a way of seeing. And so, if at some level healthcare staff disconnect and become caring, what needs to happen so that they can see themselves and the world differently? Is there something they're not seeing about themselves, God, that might enable them to shift the way they are in the world? And then, of course, we get to those great spiritual questions in that question for singing, the four great ones: who am I, why am I here, where am I going, and how do I get there? And if we look at all the stuff that comes up in people's responses, what they think spirituality is, meaning, purpose, connection, relationships, belonging, being, and so forth, that word connection in there, and that there is something other, there's something transcendent, there's something more than me in the world, which, despite what Freud or Fallback or Marx say, it is real. There is a reality there beyond reality, another plane of consciousness, a different way of perceiving myself and the world. Can I say this? Maybe if I tell the story, it will illuminate it. If you say, I'm thinking of somebody in a particular group, let's call him Philip, the doctor, and during the course of the group work said, if I mess up, I really beat myself up. I feel like I'm shit, I'm no good, I'm crap, I'm never going to make it as a doctor, right? So as soon as he makes an error or is told he's made a mistake, not only does he suffer from the feeling I've made a mistake, but his own inner critic sweeps in big time. You're rubbish, you're crap, you're a bad doctor, you're never going to make it. So he feels bad, he's depressed, he doesn't like being around patients, and he cuts himself off. When Philip began to look at that, and I said to him, when you see yourself shouting at yourself, and actually what we did was we had a little teddy bear in the room. The teddy bear sat there, and I said to him, so here you are, Philip, and I stood over this teddy bear, and I swore at it and told it was rubbish, you're a bad doctor, you're useless, you should never make a mistake, you're supposed to be perfect, you're never going to make it. And he looked at this teddy bear and he burst into tears. He burst into tears, this big psychiatrist. And I said, what's going on with him? He said, I feel so sorry for him. I said, well, what do you want to do with him? I said, I want to hug him. So I picked up the teddy bear, and this is a big psychiatrist in a group of doctors, and he held on to him and he was stroking him and saying, why don't you do that? Next time you hear that voice, how about, come on Philip, it's all right, you're doing your best, it's all right. And what he learned was the gateway to shifting his relationship with self. The initial response, sorrow. I feel sorry for you. And feeling sorry opens the door of compassion. I feel sorry. I want to hold you. And even when he put the teddy next to his heart and held on to it, he's kept the teddy. I never got it back from that class. But that simple example is used so many times of when we look at the way we hit ourselves when we're in trouble, when we're suffering, it becomes then a double whammy. And how can we break into that? Well, for him, it was using processes that. And of course, he went beyond that then into realizing and said, well, even, when you feel like this, do you feel, no, I'm not on my own? And he went on to say, I've always known there is something there taking care of me. I've always known, but I can't talk to that about people at work because they'll think I'm psychotic. And anyway, what he found for him, he explored more deeply the notion of the transcendent. There is something other that holds me. And as a result of which he has said and said repeatedly, still in touch with him, it's changed the way he practices as a doctor. And also we got into a conversation how in working with people from the mental health field, who in my naivety when I started doing so about 15, 20 years ago, I always assumed that psychologists and psychotherapists and psychiatrists must be really clued up about their own inner processes because they're so good at helping people out with theirs. And I've never in my life let a part of my profession that is so, almost universally ignorant of their own inner life. They can tell you chapter and verse about somebody else's neuroses, but have never, and it's almost like, and you get this with theologians as well, with ministers, it's almost like I will study this thing as a thing out there that I can apply to others to avoid having a look at what it really means for me inside. It's a safe option, a defence. Does that make sense? I think. So, and of course, Philip in his case has now gone into a place of deep inner inquiry, and I think he's going to go and be a priest. I'm sorry, his colleagues would regard him as lost because he's got God, you see, as far as they're concerned. So that notion that search. Now, and Harold Koenig in his classic work in the early 2000s at Duke University, North Carolina, was producing a huge volume of work on the connection between the religious, spiritual, and health and well-being. And a real, very, very strong links. But then along comes Sloan, his book, really fascinating. I read Koenig and then read Sloan, and they ought to be companion books after you get my books, of course. But Sloan comes in, he gives really good critique of the way the research is often done. You know, if you say, well, people who attend church are more likely to be healthy, and then you really, oh, that looks like really good, yeah, now, you know, these people are really healthy compared to the. But of course, the people who are going to church are more likely to be healthy simply because they can walk to church. Who isn't at church might be unhealthy, you see. Simple things like that were missed out from the research. And Sloan laughing lovingly points out, he says, he makes a bit of a dig at religious people. I encounter this in my own church. I know people who keep coming to church. They don't believe, they don't get it, they can't stand the doctrines, they come along because it's our little village church and it's where you get to know who's selling their house and all that kind of stuff. And they keep, you know, I keep coming because I hope someday, I don't really believe all this stuff, Stephen, you know. And Sloan says that kind of faith is the equivalent of, if I sit in my garage long enough, I'll turn into a car. You get that going on sometimes with our religion. You know, if I hang out with this long enough, and I've done it myself with various, when I was swimming the length and breadth of the New Age with it. If I really get this, I really get Buddhism, if I really keep trying and go on retreat, I really get Hinduism if I do this. And I remember one way I did it when I was doing, just went to seminary, it's like funny, was when we were studying Sikhism, and I went to the Gurdwara in Huddersfield, and I was loving it, you see the Guru Granth Sahib, there behind the Guru is there behind that, and everyone's taking care of it and everything like this. And then afterward they'd shown me round and I sat in meditation with them, and I was taken down into their cellar where they feed you, and boy do they feed you. I went out there absolutely stuck. These women would not let me leave unless I'd eaten a dozen chapatis and things like that, and I thought, I really believe this. I really they feed you well. This is faith in practice. You are so stuffed with carbohydrate, you're really benevolent afterwards. So the Sloan studies are fascinating. I won't dwell on those things, but a couple of things are fascinating that followed on from those Koenig and other studies about the assumption arising that if you're religious stroke spiritual, you're more likely to be healthy. But there's quite a lot of studies that have shown that people from religious or with spiritual practices can actually be unhealthier at the time of crisis because they feel God or their faith or whatever has abandoned them, or I failed though it's not working. And certainly if you look at Van der Laan's work and others on particularly the role of women and gay people in churches, in some churches, it actually is more unhealthy for them. They hang on in there, but they're constantly receiving low-level, sometimes not so low-level messages that you are worthless, you are secondary, you are other. And they internalise that and it affects their whole life, the mental health and so forth. And the particular one mentioned, Linda's and Lancaster. Oh yes, also Krause and stuff is fascinating work, and Cassidy did one in 2008. They found, developed Koenig's work further, they were finding that people with some kind of spiritual practice, religious attendance, were more likely to be healthy than those who didn't have those things. But what Krause was beginning to find was, in her study on churches in Norway, when she looked at the ones within the church, within the healthy cohort, she found a distinct diversion, that even healthier, those who were going to church were reporting higher levels of health, lower blood pressure, less risk of cancer and so forth. But the healthiest of lot were not those who were getting something out of church. They felt they were giving. They felt they had some opportunity to give of themselves without necessarily expecting something to come back. So Sloan went on to say, well, despite all the research there, look at that. I love this. Causal connection is the word I want us to hook onto. There's no causal connection. And then he hits the word, you know, what if there's a third factor? What is this third factor? What is this thing that makes the bridge between I, it, and I, thou? What is the bridge between, that makes the difference between you're an irritating patient, I'm walking away from you, to how can I help? You, I want to beat you up because you're no good, to, let me help you. And of course that brings in, I'll pass on that for now. I'll leave that one out as well. Yeah. So in short, we've got, I want to use 5 Fs. And am I still okay for time, Chris, now?
Yes, it's about 5:30, so we have time for discussion.
Okay, I'll shut up very quickly, promise. 5 Fs quickly to summarise. If we look at the broad evidence from all the many studies, we can say with reasonable degree of certainty that if you have some form of faith, and there's no evidence that it's faith in any particular religion or tradition or form of God, you simply believe, and atheism is its own form of faith, but if it could be faith in politics, it could be faith in football or opera, but you believe something that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose in life, then that appears to strengthen us, makes us feel more okay in the world. If we have fellowship, family, friendships, if we look at the studies, loads of them now. Mental Health Foundation did a big one of about 3,000 people, 2010. Somebody else whose name has escapes me, will come back in a minute. Lindbergh et al. Did one in the States of about 200,000 people. I'll ask you this, see if you can tell me. What is more dangerous than smoking 15 cigarettes a day? More dangerous than exceeding your alcohol limit by 3 units? More dangerous than obesity? Any clues? Loneliness. Loneliness. On all scales, if you are experiencing loneliness, and it could be argued, of course, if you're lonely, you don't have the motivation to eat properly, you're going to exercise, all kinds of factors. But there seems to be something going on in the isolated person that makes them unhealthy, contributes to unhealthiness. And anyone knows how, or if you've ever been on your own, I mean really on your own, say for example, you've been facing surgery, or you've had and suddenly you realise you're into that pit of fear, that dark place, you'll know what it's like. And it's a really unhealthy place to be. Really unhealthy place to be. I remember being in a treatment room in Canberra, Cairns emergency unit, about to be defibrillated and everything, and I was shit scared. And I know all the machinery, I know what it can do to you, and I was going to have drugs to put me to sleep and everything, and I was really, really frightened. I thought I was going to go. I thought, this is it, and I'm in bloody Australia. And I spoke to this lovely doctor, and I said, can I speak to my kids? It's 2 o'clock in the morning then, you don't want to be waking them up. And he was lovely and matter of fact. He said, and by the time we've done this, either you'll wake up or you won't, and we've solved it. But this nurse came along, she just put a hand on my shoulder and she said, you're right, you need to be alone for a moment, don't you? And just that touch, just being with me and let it be on my own, allowed me to go into that place of fear and hold it while they did what they had to do. So loneliness is a killer, arguably one of the greatest killers now. The third element is fulfilling work. That at the end of the day or night, I feel I have done something that makes me feel purposeful in life. I've earned enough money to pay my mortgage, or I've done something that helps somebody to feel good, or I've provided a good service. But the work is feeling fulfilled. Look at our culture right now, where relationships are increasingly atomized, where you're told, unless you're individual and you're succeeding, then you're lower down and down and down. People who take buses are losers, who are increasingly doing work that's short-term, without security, so on and so forth. So, is it any wonder the world's getting sicker? And as we've said earlier, in an increasingly secular world, where we assume that shopping at Tesco will make you happy, or whatever. Lastly, free giving. Again, from the studies we can say that if you're involved in something that makes you feel authentic free giving, not I must give something to you so I'll feel better, but an authentic giving, I'm participating, I'm making the teas at church, I help my neighbour, I look after my kids, whatever it might be, there is that sense of something flowing through us, the free giving. So those 4 F's counter the other big F, which is fear. If we look at the impact of fear upon the body, 3 classic studies there. The PNI response by Pert found that when you're scared, your immune response is compromised, especially if the fear is low level and long term, like you've got cancer, like you're anxious at work. The fear suppresses your immune system, and ultimately then you're more likely to get sick, more likely to get cancer, more likely not to be able to fight off an infection, more likely that your wounds won't heal. Psychoneuroimmunology, PNI, fascinating book, Candy Pert's book. She was the first in the field to raise your isotope hormones and enzymes and watch them whiz around your body when you were feeling sad, happy and everything else.
What's PNI?
Psychoneuroimmunology. It makes me feel like I'm a professor when I can say that. Psychoneuroimmunology. The basic thing is you're scared, psycho, suppresses your immune system, immunology, because your nervous system and your immune system are closely linked. So your immune system gets suppressed, you're more likely to get sick or have trouble recovering. If you then remove the fear that someone has by the touch of the shoulder, an explanation, it'll be all right, shall I stay with you, can we have somebody look after you? If you reduce the anxiety, clear explanation, being in a trusting environment, the brakes come off the immune system, your immune system then kicks in and it starts to do what it has to do to help and heal your body. Get that? So it's a feedback mechanism. Secondly, the fascinating work. Now they began in Children and Martin on the heart math studies in the States. Fascinating stuff. They were the first ones to demonstrate the electromagnetic field of the heart is 70% bigger than the electrical magnetic field of your brain. 70% bigger. And what is more, just by doing this, at some level, apart from frightening Chris, at some level, just simply by touching Chris for a few seconds, in his brain will have registered my heart rate. And my brain will have registered his heart rate. And what is more, what they then began to find was every one of us in this room now, if we were to do ECGs and EEGs, we would begin to see mirrored in our brains a recording of each other's heart rates. They've even begun to suggest now that sometimes that radiant heart quality, when you're feeling connected and okay, reaches out way, way, way beyond you. And anyone who's sat in a room, at the back of a room with the Dalai Lama there in front of you, with his enormous compassionate heart, tell you, my God, his electromagnetic field must be huge. and they're looking at how that affects you, and they do exercise. Well, actually, if you look at the exercises they recommend to come back to what they call coherence, what I would call harmony or connection, they're very, very simple things rooted in the Christian, Buddhist, Hindu traditions about how you reconnect with your source using your breath. You shift imagery from fearful to warm and loving imagery and so on and so forth. And it produces an immediate impact on your blood pressure, your heart rate and so on and so forth. Fascinating work being done now from the Heart Math team. Their website is excellent. And lastly, rational relationality. We're also showing that when you're in right relationship with somebody, when you feel okay with yourself, others, the world, God, you're more likely to be healthy. And how one cultivates it. So, I'll finish off by saying, Ian Forster, only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its highest. Live in fragments no longer. That whole notion of what appears to support our health and well-being is connection. I mentioned Buddha before. And that's what's a common phrase now we hear from Ian Forster, only connect. The trick, of course, is how do you do it? How do we practice? And if we look at what the religious traditions have to offer, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Scientists, children, and others are using processes, and I read them, and they're good, they've got fabulous marketing, their website's slick, and they're selling, and I read that, I'm thinking, this is the Jesus meditation. This is Buddha. Nothing is new. What is it? There's nothing new under the sun. And so the question then is left with about how do we find processes that support that connection. I've touched on some of them. tonight, but I'll stop there.
Thank you.